Ethan Miller had learned how to disappear without actually leaving. It wasn't something he decided one day. It happened slowly, the way dust settles on unused furniture. After his wife passed away 3 years earlier, life didn't collapse all at once. It narrowed. The world shrank into a small, exhausting routine made of early alarms, late-night shifts, and a constant mental checklist of bills that could wait another week. Ethan was 36, but most mornings he felt much older. His hands were rough and permanently cracked from warehouse work. His shoulders carried a dull, unrelenting ache that never quite went away. During the day, he worked maintenance at a small community center, fixing broken doors, mopping floors, replacing flickering lights. At night, he loaded delivery trucks until his legs felt like concrete. He didn't complain. Complaining didn't keep the lights on. The only part of his life that still felt soft, still felt alive, was his son. Noah was 8 years old, skinny in that way kids get when they grow faster than their clothes. He had Ethan's dark hair and his mother's eyes, wide, curious, and always searching for something good in the world. He asked questions about everything. Why the moon followed the car? Why people got angry? Why some houses had lights on all night? Ethan didn't always have answers, but he always tried. Most evenings, dinner meant reheated leftovers eaten quietly in their small apartment. Ethan usually nodded off on the couch before Noah finished his homework. Life was survival, nothing more. That's why that night mattered more than it should have. It was a Thursday, and Ethan had just finished a brutal double shift. His body begged for sleep, but Noah tugged at his sleeve with hopeful eyes. "Dad," he said carefully, the way kids do when they already know the answer might be no. "Can we go to the diner tonight?" Ethan hesitated. Money was tight, tighter than usual, but the diner on Route 11 was cheap, familiar, and Noah hadn't asked for much lately. "All right," Ethan said after a moment. "Just tonight." Noah's face lit up like he'd been handed a gift instead of pancakes. The diner was exactly the same as it had been for years. Neon lights buzzing softly, cracked vinyl booths, the smell of coffee that never really left the air. It wasn't fancy, but it felt safe, predictable. They slid into a booth near the window. Noah pressed his hands against the glass, watching headlights streak past in the dark. Ethan ordered water. Noah ordered chocolate chip pancakes with whipped cream, extra chocolate chips. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, jotted it down without judgment. Ethan watched his son talk animatedly about school, about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar. He nodded, smiled when he could, laughed when it mattered. Moments like this were rare, fragile. Ethan held on to them quietly. Across the diner, two men sat in a corner booth. Ethan noticed them without really looking. Their voices were loud, too loud. Empty beer bottles cluttered the table. One of them laughed sharply, the sound carrying across the room like a warning. Ethan instinctively shifted Noah closer to the inside of the booth. He didn't want trouble. Trouble was expensive. The waitress returned with the food, balancing plates carefully. As she leaned in to place one down, her elbow clipped the edge of the men's table. A glass tipped. Water spilled. The reaction was immediate. "What the hell?" one man barked, standing halfway up. I'm sorry," the waitress said quickly, reaching for napkins. The other man grabbed her wrist. Hard. The sound of the diner changed. Forks paused midair. Conversations died halfway through sentences. No one said anything. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "Watch where you're going," the man sneered. His grip didn't loosen. The waitress tried to pull back. Her voice trembled. "Please, let go." Ethan's mind raced. He could already see the consequences lining up in front of him like dominoes. Police, reports, losing his job, court dates he couldn't afford. Noah sitting in a waiting room while adults argued over things he didn't understand. Ethan looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. Not his problem, he told himself. Someone else would step in. Someone with more money, more strength, more margin for mistakes. He cut Noah's pancakes into smaller pieces, focusing on the task like it might anchor him. But Noah wasn't looking at his plate. He was staring at the waitress. "Dad," Noah whispered. Ethan didn't answer. His jaw tightened. The man laughed, blocking the waitress's path. "Relax, we're just talking." The fear on her face was unmistakable now. Real, raw. Noah slid out of his seat. Ethan reached for him instinctively. "Noah!" But Noah didn't move away. He stood there, small shoulders squared, eyes fixed on his father. "Dad," he said again, louder this time. His voice shook, but it didn't break. "She's scared." The words landed heavy in Ethan's chest. Noah swallowed, then said the sentence that would change everything. Please help her. Ethan felt something inside him shift. Slow, painful, unavoidable. Fear was still there. Loud, logical. But beneath it was something stronger. The weight of his son's trust. The kind of man he was teaching Noah to be, without ever meaning to. Ethan pushed himself out of the booth. His legs felt unsteady. The diner seemed too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. He didn't know what he was going to say or do. He just knew he couldn't sit down again. Ethan didn't feel brave standing there. If anything, he felt painfully exposed, like someone had peeled away the thin armor he wore every day and left him bare under fluorescent lights. His heart hammered against his ribs, loud enough that he was sure everyone could hear it. The man holding the waitress finally noticed him. "What?" the man snapped, turning with a crooked grin. His breath carried the sour sting of alcohol. "You got a problem?" Ethan swallowed. His mouth was dry, his thoughts scattered. He wasn't built for confrontations. He hadn't thrown a punch since high school, hadn't raised his voice in years. He worked hard to stay invisible because invisible people didn't get hurt. But behind him in the booth, Noah was watching. Ethan straightened his shoulders. "Just a little." "Let her go," Ethan said. The words came out steadier than he felt. The other man laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that scraped across the diner. "Look at this guy," he said, nudging his friend. "You her boyfriend or something?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Just let her go." For a split second, it looked like the man might actually listen. Then his grip tightened instead. "Mind your business," he said, giving the waitress a rough shake. The room froze. Ethan felt the fear spike, hot and electric. But something else moved with it now. A deep, grounded resolve. The kind that didn't come from confidence, but from necessity. "This is my business," Ethan said quietly. That was when the shove came. It was sudden and forceful, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward into a table. Plates rattled. Someone gasped. Ethan barely caught himself. The men laughed. "What are you going to do?" one of them sneered. "Cry about it?" Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. He thought of Noah's small voice. "She's scared." He stepped forward again. The first punch was wild, sloppy, and fueled by alcohol. Ethan barely had time to react. He raised his arms instinctively, deflecting it just enough to avoid taking it full on. Pain flared anyway, sharp and immediate. Chaos erupted. Chairs scraped backward. Someone shouted for the manager. The waitress broke free and scrambled away, hands shaking as she covered her face. The second man lunged, aiming for Ethan's chest. There was no strategy, no clean movement. Ethan acted on raw instinct, planting his feet and pushing forward with everything he had. His shoulder slammed into the man's midsection, driving him off balance. They crashed into the edge of a booth, the impact jarring and messy. One of the men slipped, hitting the floor hard. The other stumbled into the counter. It was over almost as quickly as it started. Ethan backed away immediately, hands raised, chest heaving. His whole body trembled now, not from adrenaline alone, but from the sudden weight of what he'd done. The diner buzzed with frantic noise. Phones were out. Someone was calling 911. The manager stood pale and rigid behind the counter, unsure where to look. Ethan's gaze snapped to the booth. Noah was still there, still watching. Their eyes met. Noah wasn't smiling. He wasn't scared either. He just looked certain, like he had seen something important and filed it away quietly. Ethan's stomach twisted. The police arrived within minutes, red and blue lights washing over the diner windows. The men were cuffed, still yelling, still drunk. Ethan answered questions with shaking hands, replaying every second in his head. What if this costs me my job? What if I messed up everything? Witnesses spoke. The security footage was reviewed. Slowly the tension eased, but the fear didn't leave Ethan's chest. When it was finally over, when the officers told him he could go, Ethan didn't feel victorious. He felt exhausted. As he guided Noah toward the door, his son reached for his hand and squeezed it tightly. Ethan squeezed back. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if he'd made the right choice. But he knew one thing for sure. He hadn't stayed seated. And whatever came next, he would face it standing up. That night, sleep never came. Ethan lay on his back, staring at the cracked ceiling of their apartment, every muscle stiff and sore. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to slow down. Every time he closed his eyes, the diner replayed itself. The shove, the punch, the sound of plates rattling. And worse than all of it, the look on Noah's face. Not fear, not confusion. Something steadier. Something that made Ethan's chest ache. He turned his head toward the small bedroom doorway. Noah's door was open, just the way Ethan always left it. His son slept curled on his side, clutching a worn blanket like a lifeline. His breathing was slow and even, blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside his father. Ethan swallowed hard. What if I ruined everything? That question looped endlessly. What if someone filed a complaint? What if his employer decided he was a liability? What if the police changed their minds? Ethan lived paycheck to paycheck. There was no cushion, no backup plan. He wasn't afraid for himself as much as he was afraid for Noah. Morning came too quickly. Ethan moved through the routine on autopilot, brushing teeth, packing a simple lunch, tying Noah's shoes. He forced a smile where it mattered, kissed Noah's forehead at the bus stop, and watched until the doors folded shut. "You okay, Dad?" Noah asked before climbing aboard. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, buddy, just tired." It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. At work, Ethan felt like a ghost walking through familiar halls. Every sound made him flinch. Every time someone called his name, his stomach tightened. He kept expecting a tap on the shoulder, a quiet request to follow someone into an office. By mid-morning, it happened. "Ethan," his supervisor said, voice unreadable, "can you come with me for a minute?" The words landed heavy. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and followed without speaking. His heart pounded with every step. This was it, the moment he'd been bracing for since the night before. The office door closed behind him, but instead of an empty chair and a termination speech, Ethan froze. Someone else was already inside. A woman sat calmly near the window, posture composed, presence undeniable. She wore a charcoal blazer, her hair neatly pulled back, a leather portfolio resting on her lap. She stood as Ethan entered, extending her hand. "Ethan Miller," she said. "Thank you for meeting with me." Her voice was professional but warm. "I'm Rebecca Hall." The name meant nothing to him, not yet. Ethan shook her hand, confusion and anxiety tangling in his chest. He glanced at his supervisor, who offered a small, reassuring nod before quietly stepping out and closing the door. Rebecca gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Ethan did, his thoughts racing. Lawsuit, liability, damage control. That had to be it. People like him didn't get summoned by well-dressed strangers for good reasons. Rebecca studied him for a moment, not critically but thoughtfully. "I know you're probably wondering why I'm here," she said, "so I'll be direct." Ethan braced himself. "I watched the footage from the diner last night." His breath caught. She continued gently, every angle, every second. Ethan's jaw tightened. He waited for the reprimand, the warning, the thinly veiled threat. But it didn't come. Instead, Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "I want you to know," she said, "that what you did mattered." Ethan blinked. She spoke about the waitress, Lily, about how close she'd been to walking away from her job, from school, from the future she was trying to build, about how fear had been slowly grinding her down. And then, Rebecca said, one person stood up. Silence filled the room. Ethan didn't know what to say. He hadn't stood up to be noticed. He'd stood up because his son believed he would. Rebecca smiled faintly, as if she could read the doubt on his face. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about possibility." Ethan felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable. For the first time since the night before, the fear loosened its grip. He didn't know where this was leading, but for the first time he allowed himself to believe it might not end in loss. Ethan sat very still, hands folded loosely in his lap, afraid that if he moved too much, whatever was happening might disappear. Rebecca Hall closed the portfolio in front of her, but didn't open it yet. Instead, she spoke calmly, as if she weren't about to upend a stranger's entire life. "The diner you were at last night," she said, "is part of a group owned by Meridian Food Services. I'm the regional director overseeing safety and operations." Ethan nodded slowly, trying to process the words. Corporate, regional, director. None of it sounded like it belonged in his world. "I came today," Rebecca continued, "because what happened last night wasn't just an isolated incident. It showed us something we've been missing." Ethan shifted in his chair. "I didn't plan any of it," he said quietly. "I was just trying to get my kid home safe." Rebecca smiled at that, not politely but genuinely. "That's exactly why I'm here." She explained how Meridian had invested heavily in policies, manuals, and training videos, how they talked endlessly about safety, respect, and accountability. But when it came down to it, too many people still froze, looked away, waited for someone else to step in. And then there's you, she said. Someone with no title, no authority, no obligation, who acted anyway. Ethan's instinct was to deflect. Anyone would have done the same. Rebecca shook her head gently. You and I both know that isn't true. She opened the portfolio then, sliding a single document across the desk toward him. Ethan stared at it, his heart pounding. This is a proposal, Rebecca said. Not a contract yet, just an idea. The word proposal made Ethan uneasy. Big words usually came with fine print. She explained that Meridian was restructuring how it approached guest and employee safety across its locations. They wanted to build something practical, something grounded in real experience, not corporate theory. We need someone who understands fear from the inside, Rebecca said. Someone who knows what it means to have something to lose. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Rebecca took a breath. I'd like you to consider a position as a safety and response coordinator. You'd help identify risks, train staff, and build protocols that actually work in real-life situations. Ethan blinked, once, twice. I don't have a degree, he said. I'm not qualified for that kind of job. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. You're more qualified than you realize. She went on to explain the support the company would provide. Training, mentorship, a gradual transition. The role came with a full-time salary, benefits, consistent hours. Numbers were mentioned. Numbers that made Ethan's head spin. More than he earned in both jobs combined. Health insurance, paid time off, even a retirement plan. Ethan leaned back, overwhelmed. His first reaction wasn't excitement, it was suspicion. There has to be a catch, he said. People like me don't get offers like this. Rebecca didn't flinch. I understand why you'd think that, she said softly. When you spend years just trying to survive, good news feels dangerous. That landed harder than she probably realized. She slid a business card across the desk. Take 24 hours, talk it over with your son, ask questions, walk away if it doesn't feel right. Ethan stared at the card. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. Why me? He asked finally. Rebecca paused, choosing her words carefully. Because courage isn't loud, she said. It doesn't announce itself. But when it shows up, it changes everything. When Ethan left the office, the building felt different. Brighter, lighter, like the air itself had shifted. He walked to the parking lot in a daze, replaying the conversation over and over. That afternoon, he picked Noah up from school early, something he rarely had the freedom to do. Noah's face lit up when he saw him waiting by the gate. Did something happen? Noah asked, concern creeping into his voice. Ethan smiled, slow and careful. Something good, he said. I think. As they drove home, Ethan realized something profound. For the first time in years, he wasn't calculating how to get through tomorrow. He was imagining what life could look like, and that terrified him almost as much as it gave him hope. Ethan didn't sleep much that night either, but this time, it wasn't fear that kept him awake. It was possibility. He sat at the small kitchen table long after Noah had gone to bed, Rebecca Hall's business card resting between his palms. He turned it over and over, as if the words might change if he looked at them long enough. A part of him kept waiting for the catch to reveal itself. Another part, the quieter, more hopeful one, was afraid it wouldn't. In the morning, Ethan made pancakes, real ones. Not the boxed kind he usually saved for special occasions, but the kind his wife used to make on Saturdays when life still felt full of promise. Noah noticed immediately. Why pancakes, he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Ethan smiled. Because sometimes, he said, we don't need a reason. They ate together at the table, sunlight spilling through the window. Ethan told Noah about the meeting, carefully, simply, about the woman who had come to talk to him, about the job she offered. Noah listened in silence, swinging his legs beneath the chair. Does that mean you won't work nights anymore, he asked. Ethan hesitated. If I say yes. Noah's face broke into a grin so wide it almost hurt to see. Then you should say yes. That settled something inside Ethan. By the end of the day, he made the call. The transition wasn't instant. It was careful, deliberate, exactly the way Ethan needed it to be. Meridian arranged training sessions, paired him with security consultants, and gave him time to learn. No one expected him to be polished or perfect. They expected him to be honest. Ethan traveled between locations, talking to staff members who had grown used to being ignored. Servers, cooks, hosts, people who had stories they'd never felt safe enough to tell. He listened, and that made all the difference. At one location downtown, Ethan ran into Lily again. She looked different. Straighter posture, steadier eyes, less afraid. I didn't quit, she told him quietly one afternoon. I almost did, but I didn't. She explained that she'd enrolled in a new semester of classes, that she'd applied for a small scholarship she'd nearly forgotten about. I wouldn't be here if you hadn't stood up, she said. Ethan shook his head. You did the hard part. Still, the words stayed with him. At home, Noah noticed the changes before Ethan did. Dinner was earlier. Laughter came easier. The tension that once lived in Ethan's shoulders began to loosen its grip. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old movie, Noah leaned against him and said, You don't look tired all the time anymore. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. Is that a good thing? Noah nodded. You smile more. Ethan felt something warm settle in his chest. Weeks passed, then months. Meridian's new safety program rolled out across multiple locations. Staff trainings included real conversations, not just checklists. Reporting systems improved. People felt seen. Ethan never thought of himself as a leader, but people began to seek him out anyway. Not because he had authority, but because they trusted him. One afternoon, Rebecca called him into her office again. I want you to know, she said, this is working. Because of you. Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He drove home that night with the windows down, the air cool against his face. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a threat waiting to strike. It felt like something he could finally walk toward. As he pulled into the parking lot, Noah was waiting at the door, backpack slung over one shoulder. Dad, he said, breathless. Guess what? Ethan smiled. What? Noah grinned. My teacher says we're learning about heroes next week. Ethan laughed softly. He had no idea just how close that word was about to come to home. The night of the ceremony felt unreal to Ethan. The ballroom was warm and bright, filled with soft music and low conversations. People wore tailored suits and polished smiles, the kind Ethan used to think belonged to a different world. He adjusted his jacket awkwardly, still not used to clothes that didn't smell faintly of work and sweat. Beside him, Noah tugged at his sleeve. Dad, he whispered, eyes wide. This place is huge. Ethan smiled. Yeah, it is. When Rebecca called his name, the applause caught him off guard. It wasn't loud in a dramatic way. It was steady, sincere, the kind that came from people who understood what they were clapping for. Ethan walked to the stage slowly, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had once been tired, scared, and unsure, and still was some days. Rebecca spoke briefly. She didn't glorify the fight. She didn't exaggerate the moment. Instead, she talked about a choice, about standing up when it would have been easier to stay seated, about how that choice had reshaped lives in ways no one could have predicted. Then she announced the scholarship, a fund created to support children from single-parent families, kids who carried quiet responsibility far too early. The first recipient would be Lily's younger brother. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He glanced down at Noah, who was clapping harder than anyone else, his face glowing with pride. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was unsteady. I didn't do anything special, he said honestly. I was scared. I still get scared. I just listened to my kid. A few people laughed softly, others wiped at their eyes. After the ceremony, as guests mingled over coffee and dessert, Lily approached with her brother. She looked confident now, grounded, alive. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Ethan nodded, unable to find words that felt big enough. Later that night back home, the apartment felt smaller, but warmer, familiar, safe. Noah changed into pajamas and sat on the edge of the couch while Ethan turned off the lights. Dad, Noah said quietly. Yeah, buddy? I'm glad you helped that lady. Ethan sat beside him. Me too. Noah thought for a moment. I was scared that night, he admitted, but I knew you'd do the right thing. Ethan felt emotion rise sharply in his chest. He pulled Noah into a tight hug, resting his chin against his son's hair. You helped too, he said softly. You reminded me who I wanted to be. That night, as the apartment settled into silence, Ethan understood something he hadn't before. Courage wasn't about strength or fearlessness. It was about showing up when someone needed you, especially when it cost something. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is listen. So here's the question for you. If you were there that night, tired, overwhelmed, with everything to lose, would you have stood up? Or would you have stayed seated, hoping someone else would act? Because moments like that don't announce themselves. They slip quietly into ordinary days and ask who we really are. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that celebrate compassion, resilience, and the power of small choices. And before you go, leave a comment with one word that describes how this story made you feel. Sometimes one word is enough to start something bigger. Thank you for watching.